Professor Tracy back with another contracts video, and we're continuing our look at defenses, but we're shifting gears here. For a long time, the past several lessons have been about defenses to formation, meaning that they are based on conditions or events or behaviors or circumstances that existed at the formation of the contract. So all the way through mistake, that was true. Now we're looking at three defenses which are not based on formation. They are based on events that occur after formation, and we often refer to these defenses as excuses. In other words, what they do, if they're successfully asserted, is that they excuse the party from having to perform. So their argument is, because of this event that occurred after formation but before the date of performance, I should be excused from having to perform because circumstances have changed to such a degree that's the right outcome. So we will see, as I mentioned, there are three of these excuses. The first is impossibility. The second is called impracticability, and yes, that's the word we use despite its awkwardness, is impracticability, and the frustration of purpose. And so these defenses are all rooted in events that occur after formation. One thing to just note on the front end here is that under the restatement, there is not a separate impossibility defense. Instead, they lump impossibility under the heading of impracticability. In other words, it's just a matter of degree. They treat all these kinds of situations similarly, and we'll see what I mean by a matter of degree. But basically, that if this event has made it utterly impossible, well, that's still just impracticability, just at its most extreme. And if it's just made it more expensive or extremely much more risky or burdensome, etc., then maybe it's just plain old impracticability. But the restatement lumps those all together. So if you're looking at various resources, they may talk about the idea of impossibility using the word impracticability because that's what the restatement does. For what it's worth, for years and years and years, the MBE, and part of the bar exam, has separated them out, has treated impossibility as being separate from impracticability. Now, I can't promise that that will always be the case, but that has been true for a while. So we are breaking them out here. The good news for you is that means at least two of these are very, very similar, right? Because it's really just a matter of degree between impossibility and practicability. So let's jump right to it, looking at impossibility. So when we're looking at these, we want to focus in on the elements of each of these and talk about them. And what we'll see is that for all three of these defenses, they share almost all the same elements. Only one being different in each of these cases. So for each of these, I've said it already, and I'll say it again, and we'll talk about this element in particular, but these are based on after contract formation. There is a supervening event that occurs without the fault of the party seeking relief. And we'll unpack each of these in detail in just a moment. So 3, the supervening event makes the party's performance impossible. So that's the element that's going to change depending on which defense we're talking about. But here, starting with impossibility, it will have to make performance impossible. And we'll talk about what that means. 4 says the non-occurrence of the event must be a basic assumption on which the contract was made. And finally, that a party's duty to perform is discharged unless they bear the risk, unless that party bears the risk. So that's kind of a similar exception there in number 5 to what we talked about under mistake, where if the party bears the risk of mistake, they cannot assert the defense of mistake. Similarly here, if the party bears the risk, they can't assert whatever changed circumstance defense we may have in front of us. So let's look at this. By after contract formation, Here's what we mean. Again, the timing of this is key, and the reason that I'm hammering it and you're like, dude, you said this already. I did, but it's very important to understand whether we're talking impossibility or impracticability or frustration of purpose, it must be based on that supervening event that occurs after contract formation. Because if the condition existed at formation, then it will be one of our defenses to formation that you should apply. Could be mistake, could be some other defense, but it will not be one of these changed circumstances defense. So that's why the timing here is critical and why I keep hammering it. So what do we mean by a supervening event occurring without the fault of either part of the party seeking relief, not either party, but the supervening event, we're meaning that it's intervening between the formation of the contract and when performance is due. So we're talking about something that supervenes there and says, nope, you were going to have to, this event, it's occurred, it's going to cut off your duty though, because you were going to have to perform when the date of performance came around, when performance came due, but because of this event that's occurred, you're going to be excused from having to fulfill that contract duty. This is key to understand. Unlike something like torts, it doesn't have to, when we're looking at foreseeability or unforeseeability, we're not worried about that here. Because even if it is foreseeable, the word supervening would still apply in this case, unlike how it is used in some other contexts in the law where it's like, well, an intervening cause is foreseeable, a supervening cause is unforeseeable. That's not the way it's used here in contract law. It's just meaning between formation and performance. So remember that they cannot be the cause of it. That should be straightforward. But if you are the party who caused this event to occur that rendered your performance impossible or impracticable or made it so it was worthless and frustrated the purpose of the agreement, then you cannot claim that defense because you were the reason it occurred. You were at fault. So we said that event, this third element being the key one that changes for each of these defenses, that it must render performance impossible. So what do we want to mean? What does it mean to make performance impossible? It has to be objectively impossible, meaning not just, specific to your circumstances, but objectively as in it cannot be done. Like, I would sell you this car, but it was destroyed, so it cannot possibly be sold to you. Or we would hold the concert in the concert hall, but the concert hall burned down prior to the performance. So it's impossible. Not, this is too challenging for me to do because I am subjectively unable to do it. And certainly not what either you have done or you may be around kids who say, I can't do it, it's impossible, which usually means they don't really want to deal with it and don't want to do, for instance, their math homework or whatever it may be. That's not what we have in view. So, but as I said, objectively impossible, the most common sort of fact pattern there would be something like the destruction of a thing, such as what it is the good that you are selling, or perhaps the timber on the property you are selling, or the ship that was delivering the goods, or the truck, or the train, or the plane, or whatever it is. Or it could be the death of a person who was going to provide a particular service, that kind of thing. That would make performance impossible. Those are objectively impossible. So here, there's this basic assumption, which is similar language to what we used when we were talking about mistake, that the mistake has to be about a basic assumption of the contract. This is similar in some ways, but what we're saying is, was the non-occurrence of this event, the idea that this event, that things would not go as they have, was that a basic assumption that was made when the parties entered into the agreement? Whether they expressly said so or not, was that something they assumed? For instance, that that the car would still be there, and when it came time to meet and have the sale go down, or the house was still standing, that kind of thing, that they assumed it whether they stated it or not. And we get at that in part similarly to the way we did when in mistake, right? Remember with mistake, we said, well, if they knew that the facts were as they actually are, not as they believed them to be, would they have still entered into it? And we said that gets at the idea that something is a basic assumption. Similarly here, if we can say, if they knew that this event would have occurred, well, would they have entered into the agreement? Would it have made sense? Is that the kind of contract they would have made, or no? Because if it's not, then the non-occurrence of that event goes to it was a basic assumption of the contract. One thing to know is that thinking, I assume that this would be that this would be profitable to me, that I would make a lot of money, that the market would stay in a favorable condition for me, or that my financial condition generally would stay positive. Those kinds of things do not work. Those are not basic assumptions of the contract, even though very frequently people do make those kinds of assumptions. But we are not trying to create a defense that allows anybody to get out of a bad deal, right? That is not what contract law is trying to do. And so that's why there are certain things we go, no, that's not the kind of basic assumption we're talking about. So here, what about this exception, right? Which the first part of this is important to keep in mind, which I don't focus in on in the next slide, but keep in mind that the outcome here is that the party is excused from having to perform. Or another way of putting that is to say their duty to perform has been discharged such that they no longer have to fulfill it because we've already discharged it, right? Because the normal way to discharge a contract duty would be to perform that duty. Well, here we're saying, well, this defense, this excuse is discharging it for you so that you don't have to do it. But you're not able to, that will not occur, even if you meet elements 1 through 4, if you bear the risk of this event occurring. So here, unlike in mistake, it was, do you bear the risk of mistake? Here it's, does the party asserting this changed circumstance defense, here in possibility, do they bear the risk that this event would occur? And if they do, they are not able to assert, impossibility, impracticability, or frustration of purpose. So here we are allocating the risk, just like with mistake, and it can be done the same ways, right? The contract itself could allocate the risk using, instead of something like with mistake, we talked about like an as-is clause or something, or some kind of disclaimer. But here, what we're talking about is usually what's called a force majeure clause, where the parties are specifically saying, these are the only kinds of things that, these are the kinds of things that could occur after we form a contract, and here's how we will deal with them, right? It will spell out, here are the possible things that may occur, here's how they would be dealt with the contract, and it will tell us whether or not the parties are agreeing. These kinds of things will excuse the parties, these kinds of things will not. And so they're allocating the risk of particular types of events to the parties. Conscious ignorance would be the same way. If you knew that this kind of event could occur, I don't know whether it might, and I don't really care to plan for it, I'm just going to plow ahead. Same idea, similar idea to how we dealt with it with mistake. Here, there's also this catch-all, right? That a court could allocate the risk just by saying it's the fair thing, it's the equitable thing, it's reasonable under the circumstance to do so, so that's what we're going to do. So that's allocating the risk. The remedy, as I said, is they're excused from having to perform. That means their duty to perform is discharged. So we already referred to that. And the other thing I didn't mention, so it's good this is here to remind me, is it's possible that one party, depending on how the performances are ordered, it's possible one party has performed, but the other party, their performance has not yet come due. when this event occurs, but yet they've already received some sort of benefit from the other party. So there may be restitution that needs to be made depending on how things have unfolded. So let's look at a quick example here. We've got Bob, we've got Herman, and they've entered into a contract. And so Herman is selling Bob his used 2021 Ford Bronco, and Bob is going to pay $10,000, so quite a deal, to Herman for that Ford Bronco. So that's the contract they entered into. And here, it's important for us as we talk about impossibility. Remember, that's an example. Our example here is about impossibility. We need to be very specific, and that this is not just Herman saying, "I will provide to you a 2021 Ford Bronco." It's no, I will provide to you my 2021 Ford Bronco. It's mine. So as I said there, Herman's Bronco, and here is its vehicle identification number, its VIN number, and here is the current mileage of it, etc. Right? Like that particular Bronco is what we have in view, and you'll see why in a second that matters. And then there's a supervening event, right? So a tornado tears through town and causes problems, right? Bob shows up and he's ready to perform. He goes, "No, okay, I have the $10,000. Now hand over the car." You do know that a tornado ripped right through my house and destroyed my Bronco. Sure, but you promised the Bronco and I expect you to deliver the Bronco." "Well, that can't happen." So there, Bob is being a jerk, right? He's like, "I don't care that you lost your house and your car and everything you own. I want the Ford Bronco. You said you would provide it. You're not, so I'm suing you for breach." And then Herman here, the reason instead of the shield I've been using, I've got this stop sign kind of shape, which what we call an octagon where I'm from, where there is, it's saying impossibility. He's raising an excuse, right? And I just wanted to distinguish a defense to formation where we're using a shield shape and an excuse, which is based on an event that happens after formation here. So impossibility. So here he's raising that impossibility, right? He's saying this. And so keep in mind, does it work here? Is it going to work? And the answer is yes, it will. But before we go too far with this, understand why. If we think back to our elements, after formation, right, the timing of this, they formed the contract for the purchase and sale of the 2021 Ford Bronco. Then the supervening event occurred, right? The tornado ripped through town, and a basic assumption of this contract, very easily proven, is that the Ford Bronco would not have been destroyed, right? It would not have been destroyed. That it would be there, and Herman would be able to convey that to Bob. And so when the tornado ripped through town and destroyed the Ford Bronco, then he can't do that, right? So it goes to a basic assumption of the agreement. And we can say, what else? That it makes it impossible. It is objectively impossible. But why? This is why we went into all the detail. If the contract had just said, provide a 2021 Ford Bronco, then that's not impossible. He could go out to the market and find one. It might be difficult. He might have to do so at a loss, but it ain't impossible. Maybe he could try to argue impracticability if it's super costly or whatever, but he could not argue impossibility. But here, because it was his specific Ford Bronco with his VIN number and mileage, etc., we can say, yeah, it's impossible. That Ford Bronco was destroyed by a tornado. It cannot be conveyed to Bob. It's literally, objectively impossible. Okay? And the result of that is what? That the duties will be discharged unless the risk should be allocated. Otherwise, it's not allocated here to Herman. Right? The risk of this tornado. There are no facts that suggest it should be allocated to him. So in this case, here I said duties discharged because it's literally impossible for this to occur at all, right? For this transaction to go down. So that all the duties will be discharged under the agreement and there will be no liability on it. Impracticability then, remember I said it's a matter of degree. So in essence, impracticability is going, well, it's not impossible, but it's real hard. And because it's real hard, I'm going to try to argue it's so hard, it's not fair to require me to honor the agreement any longer. So it's sort of a lesser threshold. I'm not trying to say it's impossible, but I am saying it's really going to be costly or risky or burdensome or difficult to such a degree that we should call it impracticable. But remember here, I said we share a lot of elements. So if we look at what we just covered, we can say it shares a lot of elements with impracticability. So this was impossibility, what we just looked at, and I told you that third element is the one that's going to change. And here we said with impossibility, it must make the party's performance impossible. Well, switch it up. With impracticability, we don't have to make it impossible. The third element, it says what? It makes the party's performance impracticable, right? Isn't that nice that it's not that hard to know that, oh, there's this whole other defense. We just substitute the word impracticable for impossible, and we've got impracticability. Voila. But that, I'm not going to review all the elements, but we do need to know what impracticable meant, because we already went through elements 1, 2, 4, and 5, and they're all the same. It's the third, so we need to know, what do we mean by impractical? It's like, nobody uses that word. Who talks like that, right? What we mean here, honestly, is a little bit difficult to nail down, because what you have is the UCC developing this idea, and you have the drafters of the restatement adopting this idea, and courts using it, but honestly, pretty sparingly, because how we're using it here, remember, is the restatement, again, lumps impossibility under the heading of impracticability. It just treats that as impossibility as an extreme version. Well, if that's the case, it's like, okay, we understand those cases, sure, that makes sense. But if you limit it to things that aren't impossible, but have become extreme and unreasonable difficulty or expense or injury or loss, then that becomes more difficult, and courts are reluctant, because very often there's this feeling of, well, this is a cost increase or a risk, a possibility that you should have planned for on the front end when you were negotiating the agreement. And so these things, they're phrased a couple different ways. This is language just lifted from the UCC and the restatement and the words that are used either in the comments or in the text itself, and of getting at this idea that it's extraordinarily more difficult, expensive, or risky. But those aren't very clear terms. And so we look at it, one of the other things the restatement says is it has whatever obstacle that's arisen. You can't just be like, oh man, it's real hard. Look at this thing that happened because of this event. It's hard to do. The restatement says, well, it's got to require more than ordinary reasonable efforts to overcome. Because if that's all it is, then you can't whine about it. You should have dealt with it on the front end or deal with it now. We're sorry it's hard. And so, but you have to understand too that sometimes costs increase, things become more pricey, and it becomes not as profitable as you would like, or even maybe you're going to lose some money. But that doesn't mean impracticability is always there to bail you out. But it could be. The thing to know is it's not just ordinary fluctuations in the market, but we do allow something becoming much more expensive, much more difficult, etc., to give us a way out, right? To give us a potential excuse. And you have an example like this. So we have Bob and Bo now. They form a contract that is a contract I would like to have, which is, although I would not like to pay $400 a month for it, I would like it for free, because who wouldn't like free brownies every week for each week of the year? So here, Bo is promising to make and provide brownies to Bob every week for a whole year, and Bob is going to pay $400 a month for that. So that's the arrangement that they have in place. Their contract is formed because, remember, the reason we're starting here is these defenses or these excuses are based on things after formation. So we say contract formed, now this supervening event occurs. Here, it's the cost of Beau's supplies, right? That whether it's the flour he needs or the chocolate or whatever it may be to make and deliver these brownies to Bob. He's saying the cost has gone up so much, it's problematic. So Beau now says, look, it's gotten too expensive for me to keep making brownies for you at the price we agreed to. I need out of the contract or I'm going to go bankrupt. I can't allow that. I need those brownies. I quit that. You can sue me. So here, the situation is we have this increase, and he's saying it's become, extraordinarily more expensive to me because the cost of supplies has increased. And because of that, that is now, it's not impossible. I could do it, but it's going to be really costly to the point that I may go bankrupt and my company go out of business. So the question is, does that work? And Bob is not going to take no for an answer. Again, he, just like he insisted on Herman giving him the Ford Bronco, he's insisting that Beau continue to provide the brownies. And I mean, why wouldn't you? So here we have this excuse being raised by Beau, and it's impracticability here. He's going after formation, right? At formation, everything was peachy. He planned, he looked and he's going, well, I need $400 a month to make this work and profitable for me. And everything was going along super, okay, fine, and swimmingly. And then a supervening event occurred, which is that the cost increased to the point that Beau could no longer do it, right? So there was a rise in the expense of doing it. So you'd say that's the supervening event. And the argument would be it goes to a basic assumption of the contract, right? That we assumed that this amount would work for both of us, that I wasn't going to be being paid an amount that wouldn't be enough to keep me afloat, that I would lose so much money that I would go I would go out of business. And that's the argument, right? That is here. And it gets dicey, right? You can start to see where you're like, well, didn't we say this kind of thing may not work? And we did. We said it may not work, right? If it's about a market condition or about financial condition, that's the kind of thing that is not considered a basic assumption. On the other hand, you will find cases where the assertion has been upheld that this sort of marked increase in cost or expense due to whatever event that occurred is a reason to be excused. Now, to be fair, sometimes we would, and you'll see, I go like this, what's the outcome? It's a little unclear because of that fuzziness, which is that, to be fair, often you would want something like, oh, there was a horrible pandemic that caused a bunch of shipping problems and factory delays and things that did it, or there was something that caused the rise in the cost of things, or there was a big boat stuck on the canal. There was something that came about that drove this up, other than just this is an unprecedented increase in price. And arguably, that's all we have here is an increase in price. So if that's all we have, then that may not be a basic assumption of the contract on which Beau would be able to confidently and successfully assert impracticability. And if he couldn't, then he wouldn't win, right? Because the basic assumption element would not be satisfied. But if we assume that it is, or that there was some event that caused all his ingredient costs to go up, then that would work, that we go, oh, it's a basic assumption that kind of thing wouldn't have occurred. And we would look and say, okay, did it make it impractical? And there, it seems like he has a good argument that the rise in cost is very high, is extreme and extraordinary, such that he would go out of business. So it's going to turn, I think, on that burdensome element. As far as allocating the risk one way or the other, I don't think there would be an argument here to allocate it unless, and if you, the only argument I think would be would basically the same argument you would kick out the basic assumption element, which is you would go, well, this is just, if fluctuations in prices occur and you should have planned for it on the front end. So we'll just say you should be allocated the risk under number 3, right? That the court, in fairness, should allocate the risk to you because this happens, so you should have known. But I think it depends on basically the same idea as basic assumption. And so if we get one, I think we get the other as well. So what about this last one, frustration of purpose? This one's a bit different, right? Because it's not sort of on the same the spectrum of impossibility and practicability, but it is similar in many ways, right? If we line these up, we said that impossibility shares elements with impracticability. And guess what? They both share elements with frustration of purpose. So as we're looking at this then, we looked at impossibility. Remember, it's that third element there where we said it had to be, the event had to make the performance impossible. And then we saw that with impracticability, it had to make the party's performance impracticable. And we said with frustration of purpose, it's different, right? Here, it must be that this event causes the purpose of the party's performance to be substantially frustrated. It has to be that the purpose of the party's performance to be substantially frustrated. That's substantially frustrated, but the purpose of their performance, like why is it they're doing this, is what we're looking at. And so again, all the elements are the same for frustration of purpose. They're the same as impossibility. They're the same as impracticability, other than this third element. Right? Other than that. So we won't review 1, 2, 4, or 5, but we'll go back and we'll say, well, what do we mean by substantially frustrated and the purpose of the performance? What is that? So A, it's got to be the principal purpose of the contract, right? It can't just be some, like, well, it was also going to be helpful for this, or it was going to, this contract, it was supposed to be able to allow me to do X. That's not what we mean. What was the primary purpose of the agreement? What were we trying to do right here? Not what you hoped it might have the purpose of doing, right? Once this contract goes through, I'll finally have enough money to make a down payment on a house. That's not the principal purpose of the contract, right? We'd look at the contract itself and go, what is it about, right? What is it that's being bought and sold, or what service is being provided, etc. So it's got to be substantially frustrated. The principle, the purpose of whatever purpose it is, has to be substantially frustrated, meaning not like, it's not going to be quite as fun, or it's not going to be, things aren't going to work out quite as well as we'd hoped. But substantially frustrated, usually meaning like it does not make sense to do this. It is worthless for me to go through with this contract. It is meaningless, etc. That kind of thing. Not, it's not going to be quite what I hoped. So, which is why I have that third bullet there saying it's essentially worthless, right? That it's been rendered essentially worthless. So let's look at an example here. Again, we've got Bob and Bo back at it, and Bo says, "Bob, can I rent out your beach house the third week of July? I want to see the cute baby sea turtles hatch and crawl into the water." Aww. Yeah, the sea turtles are great. I'm happy to rent you my beach house for the third week of July. It'll be $1,500 for the week. So they form their agreement. You might be like, why did Tracy have them talk before it formed? This example is different. And it is important because they knew, what did they do? They had a discussion about why Bo wanted to rent the beach house. So the purpose was clearly known, what Bo's purpose was. Obviously, Bob's purpose in renting out a beach house that he owns is pretty self-evident usually. I mean, maybe not in all circumstances, but it's typically he wants to rent it out and make some money, right? It's in part an investment. So that's pretty straightforward. But why Bo in particular wants to rent it is the key question here. So we have this contract. He's going to pay the $1,500, and Bob's going to give him the beach house for that third week of July. There's a supervening event. That's the symbol for what? It's called a hurricane. Let's assume there are multiple hurricanes between when they formed their agreement and when Bo was supposed to go that third week of July. Now Bo wants out, and he goes,
Bob, I'm sad. I read that the hurricanes in May and June destroyed all the sea turtle nests along the beach where your house is.
Yeah, it is sad. I feel bad for the little guys. The good news is that my beach house is still standing. I had it cleaned and prepped for you.
It's very kind, but the whole reason I wanted to rent your beach house was to see the turtles. Sea turtles, see turtles, see the turtles. You knew. That's why I wanted to go. Frankly, it doesn't make sense for me to spend the money to rent the house for no reason.
So again, Bob, always insisting people honor their promises, says, "You breached, Bo, you breached." And Bo, again, throws up that octagon, that stop sign of, here's my excuse, here's my frustration, that there's a frustration of purpose here. His argument is the purpose of the agreement was frustrated because of a supervening event that occurred. So if we march through it here, right? They formed a contract, and after formation, a supervening event occurred. Before the date, so it was between formation and when performance was due, when that, Bo had to was going to pay off everything, pay for it, go there, use it, and Bob was going to provide this. And before that rolled around, there were hurricanes that rolled through, right? The supervening event were these hurricanes that occurred, and when you look at this, we go, was it a basic assumption of the contract that Bo would be able to use, that there would be sea turtles to see and hatch and have them crawl out into the water, and that he would be able to enjoy that? The answer is yes, it was, right? It was, and the purpose of the agreement has been substantially frustrated. Right? Because we can, even with a basic assumption, you can look and go, would Bo have entered into that contract if he knew he couldn't have seen the sea turtles? No, that was his whole reason for going, right? So here we can go, that purpose, the principal purpose, was substantially frustrated. His purpose to it, and here Bob knew on the front end. This isn't Bo just making up some reason here at the tail end of this issue. So here you can say, yes, all those things are true, and there's no reason to allocate the risk to Bo. So it should be discharged, right? And that the excuse should be successful. Bo should be able to walk away. So that is that. Those are our three excuses, our three changed circumstances defenses: impossibility, impracticability, and frustration of purpose. And that will take us then from here to finishing up our defenses. As always, thank you so much for your support. If you found the video helpful, it helps a lot if you would hit the thumbs up there and like this video and subscribe. That way you'll know when new videos are posted. I know this one is not being posted quite as early as I had hoped, but I pray that you're all doing well, and I'll be back with more. Thanks. Bye.